So one of the areas where modern psychotherapy and clinical psychology seriously doesn't cut it, in my opinion, is in the way that it works with boys and men. So this became pretty apparent in 2018, 2019, when there was a massive furor around the concept of toxic masculinity. This is very indicative of the way that the field views men and boys. And this was encapsulated perfectly in a set of guidelines that was issued by the APA, the American Psychological Association, in 2018. And these guidelines have been rolled out pretty thoroughly, resulting in, I would say, a field of endeavor, psychotherapy, clinical psychology, which is largely hostile to the way that most men and boys would probably see the world, or at least the way we used to see the world. It's changing significantly, partly because of the social engineering efforts of the psychological field, right? So all of this started, or at least is encapsulated in this set of principles and guidelines that were given to clinicians in 2018. So I'm going to go through it because it's really interesting, and yet another example of the naked politicization of the counseling and psychotherapy field, right? So in this 2018 guidelines on working with men and boys, the APA outlined masculinity itself as an ideology as follows. Masculinity ideology is a set of descriptive, prescriptive and proscriptive norms of cognitions about boys and men, whatever that means. Although there are differences in masculinity ideologies, there is a particular constellation of standards that have held sway over large segments of the population, including anti-femininity, achievement, eschewal of the appearance of weakness, adventure, risk and violence. So I think what it's trying to say is that those are bad things. I suppose you might argue some of them are objectively. Others are a lot more difficult to just off the cuff label as bad. So I suppose it's not surprising that psychological professionals would associate the eschewal of the appearance of weakness as a negative thing. After all, they are engaged in trying to get people to talk about their feelings, right? I don't think the eschewal of the appearance of weakness, that means disliking appearing weak, I don't think that is even necessarily a bad thing, or at least it's quite an understandable thing in the light of evolutionary psychology, you know, the way that we evolved. You could quite easily see why appearing weak would be, could be dangerous. I mean, there are plenty of animals that instinctively bolster their physical image, right, to appear more dangerous than they are in order to protect themselves. Cats, for example, would be the obvious example. They ball up into a ball of fur, right, to appear literally bigger than they really are. There's all sorts of instinctive, evolved reasons why appearing strong might be quite healthy, quite good for your survival. So even that, I would question whether it's an inherently bad thing. But it is very odd to see the APA demonizing effectively achievement, risk and adventure. You could understand them having a negative view of violence and anti-femininity and dislike of appearing weak, maybe. But to demonize risk, adventure and achievement is very odd indeed. But you know, we know what they're doing, right? So the truth of the matter is that the APA is, I would say, is failing men and boys, not the other way around. So it's precisely in trying to push this kind of agenda that it fails men and boys. So effectively pathologizing stoicism. This is not the remedy for the lack of uptake of psychological services by men. It's precisely what keeps them away, right? So most men, I would say, certainly the men that I know, are capable of intuiting that there is an agenda at large in these kinds of pronouncements from the governing bodies of this profession. So it's as though men were a kind of square peg and psychology is a round hole that is trying to push men through this shape that doesn't fit, and effectively just trying to bash this peg until it does fit. So I'd say that it's the profession that's at fault here, not the service users, right? So another quote by the APA: understanding the socially constructed nature of masculinity and how it affects boys and men, as well as psychologists, also is an important cultural competency. They're not the most grammatically well-educated people that write these things, are they? What a word salad that is. What it's trying to say is that masculinity is invented. It's not biological or hormonal. And men and psychologists need to understand this and change it as part of their cultural competency. So we need to change our entire culture and way of behaving because it's fake, and we can do that, and it's quite easy. We're not in line, we need to get in line, right? So let's just look at that word social construct, because people get a bit confused about that. Let's just bring it down to the most basic definition. So according to the dictionary, a social construct is an idea that has been created and accepted by the people in a society. So what the APA are trying to say is that the concept of masculinity, the standards of masculinity, old-fashioned standards now, really, to be honest, are invented. They've just been created by our society, and they are accepted by our society, and therefore they can be changed. They're not a natural drive or instinct, according to the APA. And not only is masculinity an ideology, it's a damaging one because, I quote, conforming to traditional masculinity ideology has been shown to limit male psychological development. Says who? And by what criteria? And causing restrictive emotionality, e.g. discomfort expressing and experiencing vulnerable emotions. So traditional masculine values are the result of socialization, not instinct, according to the APA, and they're dysfunctional because they result in a failure to emote. It doesn't give anything more than self-repeating studies that just echo that view in the guidelines. There's, as far as I can see, no good evidence that men emoting in a male way results in damage. It doesn't give any research to that end that I can see. It's just kind of stating that men's failure to emote is a bad thing, right? Men are not sufficiently verbose with regard to their feelings as far as psychologists are concerned, and this failure to speak articulately and unendingly about their emotions is a cardinal sin in the eyes of psychologists. Well, they would say that, wouldn't they? Because talking voluminously about your feelings is how they earn their living, right? So it's conflicted as far as I'm concerned. The role of psychologists, therefore, as they would see it, and according to these guidelines, is to facilitate a kind of revolution in this state of affairs and make men more emotive. That's really what they're trying to do. And the earlier we can get them to do this, e.g. when they're boys, the better. But it doesn't seem to have occurred to these mental health professionals that men don't emote effusively because it's not in their nature to do so, right? So why would millions of years of evolution in male psychology, which presumably is hormonal and biologically embedded to a considerable degree, why would this suddenly change to fit the demands of 100-year-old science, right? Or the current political zeitgeist. And I suppose you could say psychology and the current political zeitgeist are pretty much the same thing at this point. They don't seem to have considered the pretty highly likely possibility that most men don't emote a lot, they don't show their emotions a lot, because it would not have been profitable for them to do so. in the ancestral environment, and until quite recently, when everybody became pretty protected and sheltered. Up until very, very recently, it wouldn't have been profitable for men to show their weakness. It wouldn't have been profitable for them or anybody else that was associated with them, their families, their communities, their nation. Presumably, the human universal of male coalitional violence made it unprofitable to do that. So this is the bit where I'd kind of connect it to Brown's human universals. So psychologist Brown, who was referred to a lot by Steven Pinker in books like The Blank Slate, found hundreds of human universals. So these are things that exist in every society that we've ever seen or know about. So examples of human universals would be, a strange one would be the words for black and white. So the words for black and white are apparent in every human society that we know of. But the words for green and yellow aren't. You know, there are human societies that don't have words for the colour red or yellow. But every society has a word for the colour black and white. Male coalitional violence is a universal feature of every human society that we know about. Gender roles for men and women is a feature of every single society that we know about. And other odd things like coyness in females is, and it doesn't take a genius to work out why that is, and psychologists have explained at length why that is because obviously it's to do with parental investment. So obviously if a woman becomes pregnant and then has to raise that child on her own, that is very, very onerous. Whereas for a man, the costs of becoming a parent potentially are nil. You know, he can just run away. So therefore, women tend to be, in general, slightly more careful about the selection of sexual partners, or at least they used to be, right? When the apparatus of the state was not so all-encompassing that it could protect you as a woman, right? So these are human universals, and male coalitional violence is one of them. So quite clearly then, just being perfectly happy to appear weak and vulnerable is quite understandably not necessarily a thing that would be valued by men historically, right? So the idea that it's just invented by society is a bit weak. Evolution would be, as you know, biological evolution would be quite likely to produce that trait, right? E.g., only the men that did that survived, right? Only the men that appeared strong and were strong survived. And of course, how you are strong could be, in Homo sapiens, quite various. It wouldn't necessarily just be physical strength, right? So while women in the ancestral environment, you might argue, let's put it this way, what if in the ancestral environment women were able to be voluble and or it made sense for them to be more voluble? Let's say, for example, they would communicate a lot with each other and with children, presumably. What if men didn't profit so much from that, and they profited more by way of non-verbal communication styles? So direct action. So think herding bison over precipices, hunting silently while communicating mostly in hand signals and things like that. But modern counselling psychology doesn't care for these kind of antithetical, heretical ideas, and thus kind of approaches men with the same arrogance that Christian missionaries would approach the heathen. You know, that's almost what it's like, isn't it? Namely, to kind of convince them that their base nature and heretical beliefs are not acceptable, and exhort them to kind of mend their ways in the light of faith. That's kind of almost what's going on. It's almost like a religious missionary zeal about this, right? So the APA also found mimicry and peer socialization to be particularly problematic because it perpetuates the wrong kind of maleness, right? So I quote, "Many men are socialized by friends, mimicking behaviors and interests, also by family, e.g. imitating parents and sibling behaviors, and by peers, e.g. conforming to group social norms to avoid ostracism." Well, yep, for sure. That is how male groups work. You know, anybody who's, any man who's worked in predominantly male occupations can attest to that. There's all sorts of rites of passage and so on and so forth. And that's been discussed quite a lot, and is really interesting, actually. So think, for example, my experiences being on the building site, being the T-boy on the building site. Yes, you get sent up into the attic to look for the sky hook. You get sent into the basement to look for the black and white striped paint. And of course, you get there and you realize it doesn't exist. And you come back to a group of older men laughing at you in a derisory fashion. And that's a test. You know, that's like the male version of a shit test, is to see if you can handle it, being mocked, being kind of put in your place, right? And a lot of over-mothered and under-fathered young men, that is how I would put it, don't handle that, right? And this, we'll revisit this issue by the end of the video, because I think this is actually the problem, okay? So, but if you do handle it, then you're respected, and you start to work your way through the hierarchy of men, right? And that is what they're pointing to here. They're demonizing that and saying this is bad. You know, men shouldn't socialize each other. And as you'll see shortly, they have other quite unnatural sounding solutions to this, right? So the APA doesn't like the way men behave, and it's very confused by their tendency to, for example, enjoy physical activities and even talk about sports and things like this. I quote, "Because of the pressure to conform to traditional masculinity ideology, some men shy away from directly expressing their vulnerable feelings and prefer building connection through physical activities, talking about external matters, e.g. sports, engaging in good-natured ribbing, exchanging jokes, and seeking and offering practical advice with their male friends." Yes, that is how men in general tend to get along socially, emotionally. It's how they tend to deal with things. What it's saying here is he's pouring a little bit of scorn on that. It's starting to frame this as bad in the sense that it stops them from digging deeper into their emotionality and talking more, remember, talking more about their weakness and their vulnerability, because the APA thinks that that is healthy. And so anything that blocks that, you know, externalizing things, talking about sports, immediately proceeding to a solution, anything that does that instead of emoting voluminously and talking out your problems is bad. I'd suggest what they've got there is a feminine, but predominantly feminine model of emotion and cognition, or social cohesion and social acting. That's how predominantly women tend to work through problems. Not all women, of course, and not all men don't do it that way, but predominantly that sounds to me like a feminine model of how to relate to the world and other people, not a male, predominantly male model, as evidenced by the fact that men don't do that. If that were a naturally male way of behaving, they would do that, but it's not. This is precisely what they've described is the most natural male way of resolving emotional issues, okay? But they're setting it up as pathological. So it seems that, according to the APA at least, men shouldn't concern themselves with external matters because this is shallow, right? They should concern themselves instead with internal matters, aka emotions, because this is what the APA values, because the APA is a very feminized institution. It's a very feminine institution. Even the men that are influential in that organization and that field conform mostly to very female ways of viewing the world, right? So that's what the APA values, and indeed it actually seems to think that its job is to re-educate men and boys on these matters.